We've all been there. You ask someone a straightforward question, and immediately you can see it in their body language. Their shoulders tense up. Their arms cross. Their answer becomes vague or defensive. The conversation that could have been productive suddenly feels like an interrogation. Whether you're a manager trying to understand why a project is behind schedule, a parent trying to talk to your teenager, or a friend trying to help someone through a difficult time, the same problem keeps appearing. The moment you ask certain questions, people shut down. But what if I told you there's a completely different approach to getting honest answers? A method so effective that intelligence agencies have used it for decades to gather information from people who would never willingly cooperate with direct questioning. The secret isn't asking better questions. It's understanding why questions make people defensive in the first place, and learning to communicate in a way that bypasses those defenses entirely. Why questions trigger defensiveness. Let's start by understanding what happens in someone's brain when they're asked a question, especially one that touches on something sensitive, embarrassing, or potentially problematic. Questions are inherently probing. They signal that you want something from the other person. And when people sense they're being probed, their psychological defenses activate automatically. Think about these common scenarios. A manager asks an employee, "Why is this project behind schedule?" A parent asks a teenager, "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling in school?" A partner asks, "Why have you been so distant lately?" Each of these questions, despite being reasonable, immediately puts the other person in a defensive position. They're being asked to justify, explain, or admit something. Even if the question is asked with good intentions, the brain interprets it as potential criticism or judgment. The result: people give you the answer they think you want to hear, or the answer that makes them look best, or they deflect entirely. You don't get honesty. You get self-protection. The alternative: speaking in statements. Here's where everything changes. Instead of asking questions, you make observations or statements. This completely shifts the psychological dynamic of the conversation. When you make a statement, you're not demanding information. You're not putting someone on the spot. You're simply sharing your perception or making an observation. And this creates space for the other person to respond without feeling attacked. Let me show you how this works in practice. Instead of asking, "Why is this project behind schedule?" you might say, "I've noticed the timeline has shifted on this project. I imagine there have been some unexpected challenges." Instead of asking, "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling?" you say, "It seems like things have been pretty overwhelming lately." Instead of asking, "Why have you been distant?" you say, "I get the sense that something's been weighing on you." Notice the difference. You're not demanding an explanation. You're opening a door for them to walk through if they choose. The psychology behind it. This approach works because of how our brains process different types of communication. When someone asks you a question, especially a why question, your brain immediately goes into justification mode. You start thinking about how to explain yourself, how to defend your actions, or how to avoid looking bad. This is a survival mechanism. Questions can feel like threats to our status, competence, or character. But when someone makes an observation or statement, your brain processes it differently. There's no demand embedded in it. You can agree, disagree, or elaborate without feeling like you're being interrogated. You maintain control over what you share and how you share it. This is why statements create psychological safety, while questions create psychological pressure. The power of acknowledgement. One of the most effective ways to get honest answers is to acknowledge what might be difficult or challenging before the other person has to admit it themselves. Let's say you're a manager and you know an employee is struggling with a new system. Instead of asking, "Are you having trouble with the new software?" which puts them in a position of admitting weakness, you might say, "This new system has a pretty steep learning curve. I'd be surprised if everyone picked it up immediately without some frustration." You've just acknowledged that struggling is normal and expected. Now, the employee can say, "Yeah, actually, I have been finding it confusing," without feeling like they're admitting to incompetency. You've removed the stigma before they had to overcome it. This works in parenting too. Instead of asking, "Are you feeling stressed about college applications?" which a teenager might deny to avoid seeming weak, you say, "College application season seems designed to stress people out. It's a lot of pressure all at once." Now your teenager can open up about their stress because you've normalized it first, using assumed understanding. Another powerful technique is to speak as if you already understand the situation, but you're slightly off in your understanding. This triggers what psychologists call the correction instinct. People have a natural urge to correct misunderstandings, especially about themselves. And when they correct you, they volunteer information they might never have shared if you'd asked directly. For example, instead of asking an employee what's causing the delays on your project, you might say, "I imagine the delays are mostly coming from the vendor taking forever to deliver materials." If that's not the actual reason, they'll correct you. "Actually, the vendor has been fine. We're struggling because 2 team members left, and we haven't been able to backfill those positions." They just gave you honest information about the real problem without feeling like they were making excuses or admitting failure. This works because correcting someone feels collaborative rather than confrontational. They're helping you understand, not defending themselves to you. The "I bet" framework. One of the simplest ways to implement this approach is using the phrase "I bet" followed by an observation. "I bet that presentation took a lot of preparation. I bet there were some unexpected obstacles along the way. I bet you've been juggling a lot lately." These statements do several things simultaneously. They show empathy and understanding. They acknowledge effort or difficulty, and they create an opening for the other person to share more without feeling pressured. If you say, "I bet that project had some challenges," and the person responds, "Actually, it went really smoothly," you've still learned something. But more often, they'll elaborate on what those challenges were, because you've shown you're reopen to hearing about difficulties. The disbelief technique. Here's an advanced variation that works remarkably well, especially when you sense someone is minimizing or downplaying a situation. You express gentle disbelief at the idea that everything was perfect or easy. This prompts people to share the real story. Let's say someone tells you about finishing a major project. Instead of asking, "Were there any problems?" you say, "That's impressive. I'm sure absolutely everything went according to plan with 0 hiccups or complications whatsoever." The slight sarcasm signals that you know better, and you're creating space for honesty. They'll almost always respond with, "Well, actually there were some issues." ... double quotes, and then give you the real story. This works because you're not making them admit to problems. You're giving them permission to be honest about the reality of the situation, creating safety through specificity. Sometimes people are defensive because they're afraid of where the conversation might go. They're worried that if they admit one thing, you'll use it against them or spiral into other topics. You can reduce this defensiveness by being specific about what you're re-observing and what you're re-interested in understanding. Instead of a vague "Is everything okay?" which could lead anywhere and feels like a trap, you might say, "I noticed you've seemed quieter than usual during team meetings the last couple of weeks. I'm curious if something about the meeting format isn't working for you." You've narrowed the scope. You've been specific about what you observed, and you've suggested a concrete, non-threatening explanation. This makes it much safer for them to respond honestly. The assumption of positive intent. People are far less defensive when they believe you reassuming the best about them rather than the worst. If a deadline is missed, instead of asking "Why didn't you get this done?" which implies blame, you might say, "I know you take deadlines seriously, so I'm guessing something significant must have come up to throw things off track." You've just assumed positive intent. You've communicated that you don't think they're lazy or irresponsible. Now they can explain what actually happened without first having to defend their character. This principle applies everywhere. Assume competence, assume good faith, assume reasonable explanations, and people will be far more forthcoming about what actually went wrong. The follow-up that doesn't push. Once someone starts opening up, the temptation is to immediately start asking follow-up questions. But questions can quickly shut the conversation back down. Instead, continue using statements and observations as follow-ups. If someone says the project is behind because we lost 2 team members, resist asking, "Why did they leave?" When will you hire replacements? How are you managing the workload? Instead, say something like, "That's a significant hit to the team capacity. I imagine that's creating pressure across multiple areas. This invites them to continue sharing without feeling interrogated. They might then tell you about the hiring challenges, the workload distribution problems, and their concerns about burnout, all because you created space rather than demanding answers. Handling sensitive topics. The more sensitive the topic, the more important it becomes to use statements instead of questions. If you need to address performance issues, relationship problems, health concerns, or financial difficulties, direct questions will almost always trigger maximum defensiveness. For a performance conversation, instead of "Why has your performance declined?" you might say, "I've noticed some changes in your output over the past few months. In my experience, when someone's work shifts like this, it usually means they're dealing with something challenging, whether it's work-related or personal." You've acknowledged the issue without attacking. You've normalized that people face challenges, and you've opened the door for them to share what's really going on. The recap and reflect method. As someone shares information with you, periodically recap what you're hearing in your own words. This serves multiple purposes. First, it shows you're genuinely listening and trying to understand. Second, it gives them a chance to correct any misunderstandings. Third, it often prompts them to add more detail or context. So what I'm hearing is that the main challenge isn't the technical work itself, but coordinating across teams that are in different time zones and have different priorities. Is that right? This reflection often leads to, "Yes, exactly." And on top of that, ... double quotes. And they volunteer additional information. You're creating a collaborative, sense-making process, rather than an interrogation. Reading the response. Pay attention not just to what people say, but to their body language and tone when you use this approach. When you make a statement instead of asking a question, watch for signs of relief. People often visibly relax. Their shoulders drop. They lean in slightly. Their tone becomes more open and conversational. These are signs that your approach is working. You've successfully bypassed their defenses and created a space for honest communication. If you still see tension or guardedness, it usually means one of two things. Either the topic is more sensitive than you realized and needs an even gentler approach, or there's a relationship trust issue that needs to be addressed before they'll open up. When questions are appropriate. Now, it's important to note that questions aren't always bad. There are definitely times when direct questions are the right tool. Questions work fine when the information isn't sensitive, when there's already strong trust in the relationship, and when you're asking about facts rather than feelings or judgments. What time does the meeting start? Is perfectly fine as a question. What are the three main features of this product? Is fine as a question? But why are you behind on this project? Or, what's wrong? Or, why didn't you do what I asked? These questions will almost always trigger defensiveness because they involve judgment, evaluation, or potential criticism. The rule of thumb: the more emotionally charged or evaluative the topic, the more you should rely on statements instead of questions. Building this as a habit. Shifting from questions to statements takes practice. It's not how most of us naturally communicate, especially in Western cultures where asking questions is seen as showing interest. Start by noticing when you're about to ask a question, particularly a why question. Pause and rephrase it as an observation or statement. Practice with low-stakes conversations first. Instead of asking your colleague, "How was your weekend?" try, "I bet you were ready for the weekend." After that crazy week we had. Notice how people respond differently. They'll often share more, and the conversation will feel more natural and less like an interview. The long-term benefits. When you consistently communicate this way, something remarkable happens over time. People start coming to you with problems, concerns, and honest feedback without you having to prompt them at all. Why? Because they've learned that talking to you doesn't feel like being interrogated or judged. You've created a pattern of psychological safety where honesty is welcomed rather than extracted. This transforms relationships. Your team members will surface issues earlier before they become crises. Your kids will actually tell you what's going on in their lives. Your friends will trust you with their real struggles, not just the sanitized versions. The bottom line in getting honest answers isn't about asking better questions or creating the perfect interrogation technique. It's about understanding that questions themselves often create the very defensiveness that prevents honesty. When you shift to making observations, using statements, and creating psychological safety, you remove the barriers that keep people from being truthful with you. You're no longer trying to extract information. You're creating space for people to share it willingly. And that makes all the difference. The next time you find yourself facing a defensive person or a difficult conversation, remember, the question you want to ask might be the very thing preventing you from getting the answer you need. Try making a statement instead, and watch what happens.